Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we are really going deep on a pretty intense period, and we're going to be looking at it through the lens of The Tragedy of Liberation, a history of the Chinese Revolution, 1945-1957.
Yeah, that's a pretty hefty title, but it really does get at the heart of what we're going to be exploring in this deep dive. For you guys, it's understanding what happened in China in those immediate years after the communists won the Civil War. So we're going to be focusing on that period between 1945 and 1957, really digging into the insights this book has to offer.
Right, because it's easy to just think about, okay, the communists won, new government, but what did that actually mean for people?
Exactly.
In their lives?
And I think one of the things to keep in mind right from the start is that, the Communist Party, as they were coming to power, they made a lot of promises to a lot of different people.
Mm.
And they were very successful at kind of, tailoring their message to appeal to different groups. So, they were promising things like land to the farmers, which of course was a huge segment of the population. And then you had all the different minority groups within China. They were being promised, self-determination and more freedom, freedom for intellectuals, the ability to speak their minds, without fear of reprisal.
Right. A lot of these groups had faced oppression under the previous government.
Exactly. And then, even for businessmen, they were saying, hey, you can keep your private property. We're not going to take everything away from you. And for the workers, of course, the promise of better living standards, better working conditions, all under this banner of new democracy. So it was really a broad, it's a very appealing message.
Yeah, a broad appeal to lots of different segments of society who had very different interests. But, as we've kind of alluded to, and as the title of the book suggests, things didn't exactly pan out the way that many people had hoped.
No. And that's where, the tragedy of liberation really comes in. The book goes into detail about how quickly the Communist Party consolidated its power and how rapidly and often quite brutally they implemented socialist policies. And the book doesn't shy away from exploring the role of violence and intimidation in this transition.
Yeah.
It's not a sugar-coated version of events.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for our listeners to understand, because we're going to go into detail about all this, but just to kind of give you a sense of the overall scope, it's not just the political landscape that was changing. It's really about how ordinary life was reshaped, both in the cities and in the countryside.
Right.
We're talking about everyday experiences.
Exactly. And, the book explores how people's lives changed, how they worked, how they lived, and also how any dissent, any opposition to the new order was systematically suppressed. And of course, a key aspect of this is the establishment of a new social and political structure, very much modeled on, what was happening in the Soviet Union at the time.
Right, because the Soviet Union was really the main model for communist revolutions at that time.
Absolutely. And then, throughout all of this, the book also highlights these early signs of resistance and disillusionment. As people started to realize that the promises that were made didn't quite match up with the reality that they were experiencing.
Yeah, a lot of broken promises. And this is really what makes the book so compelling, I think, because it's not just a dry political history. It's really about the human cost of this revolution. So, okay, let's dive into this now, starting right at the end of the Civil War. When the communists were making these really enticing promises to the Chinese people, you mentioned how appealing those promises were, but I think it's important to understand why they resonated so deeply with people at that time.
Absolutely. I mean, you have to imagine what China had been through.
Yeah.
Decades of war, instability, just constant hardship for so many people.
Mm-hmm.
So these promises really tapped into those deep desires for peace, for stability, for a better life. For farmers, it was the idea of owning their own land. For minorities, it was, self-determination. Intellectuals, they wanted freedom of expression. Businessmen, they wanted stability. Workers, they wanted better living standards. And Mao, he was promoting this concept of new democracy, right, where he was talking about a gradual transition to socialism, a kind of multi-class alliance. It wasn't going to be, overnight everything changes. So, that appealed to a lot of people who might have been hesitant about a more radical, immediate transformation.
Yeah, more kind of moderate approach. So it seemed at the time.
But then, the reality starts to set in. And I think one of the first really stark examples of this is the Siege of Chengtun, which, as we mentioned, is one of those events that really highlights the human cost of the revolution. Can you talk a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah, Chengtun is It's really a tragic episode. Um, Lin Biao, who was one of the top communist generals, he laid siege to the city, which is held by the nationalists. And the siege was so effective that it basically cut off all supplies, all food, everything from getting into the city.
And what was the situation like for the civilians inside the city?
It was horrific. The nationalists, they tried to get supplies in by airdrops, but the communist anti-aircraft fire was so intense that the planes couldn't fly low enough to make accurate drops. So a
Yeah.
lot of the supplies were just, falling into the wrong hands or getting lost. And, initially the nationalist authorities, they'd actually encourage civilians to leave the city because they knew there wouldn't be enough food. But then as the siege went on, they wouldn't let anyone back in.
And then the communists, they also prevented people from leaving.
Exactly. Lin Biao, he actually reported back to Mao, and he said, we don't allow the refugees to leave and exhort them to turn back.
Wow.
So, people were trapped. And the famine inside the city, it just got worse and worse. I mean, people were starving to death. And, desperate civilians, they tried to flee. But the communist troops, they were under strict orders to prevent anyone from leaving. And the book describes, just horrific scenes of suffering, of people being, stripped of their possessions, of bandits operating in the chaos, and very few people managed to escape.
So Changchun really sets the stage for what's to come.
It does. It's a very dark foreshadowing.
Then we have the Battle of Zuzu, another major defeat for the nationalists. But the situation there, for both the soldiers and the civilians, it sounds almost as bad as Changchun.
Yeah, I mean, Zuzu was another, military disaster for the nationalists. They were completely surrounded under constant bombardment. And again, they were relying on airdrops for supplies. But the airdrops, they were just not enough. I mean, food ran out. People were eating bark and roots. The book even talks about, the planes that were trying to evacuate the wounded being filled with, dying soldiers. It was a rout. And the civilians in the surrounding villages, they were also suffering terribly. There were reports of people freezing to death. It was just a complete collapse of the nationalist forces in that area.
So 2 major victories for the communists. But then we move to Beijing. And the fall of Beijing, it's a bit different, isn't it?
Yeah, Beijing is interesting because it wasn't a bloody siege like Changchun or Zuzu. It was more of a negotiated surrender. And the tragedy of Changchun, it actually played a role in that.
Yeah.
You see, the nationalist general in charge of Beijing, Fuzhou, he was really affected by the reports of what had happened in Changchun. He had actually considered resigning. He was so disturbed by it. But in the end, he ended up negotiating with the communists through his daughter, who was, a communist herself.
Wow, so even within families, there were these divisions.
Absolutely. And after a siege about 40 days, Fuzhou surrendered. And his troops, a significant force of 240,000 men, they were integrated into the communist army. And Fuzhou himself, he was treated relatively leniently. And this, I think, sent a message to other nationalist commanders. If you surrender, you might be spared.
A kind of incentive to switch sides. So then we have the capture of Nanjing and Shanghai. Nanjing being the nationalist capital, Shanghai, the biggest city in China. And here we start to see how the communists began to, really establish their control in these big, complex urban environments.
Yeah, it's fascinating. In Nanjing, there's this almost surreal moment where, as the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, enters the city, you have this hastily formed peace preservation committee. They're putting up slogans, trying to maintain order.
Mm-hmm.
But very quickly, the real power shifts to the communists.
Right.
And in Shanghai, you have General Chen Yi. He becomes the mayor, and he immediately addresses the existing police force.
Yeah.
And he basically tells them, you need to reform your practices, but you're going to continue to do your job. So, there's this initial reliance on some of these old structures
Right.
to keep things functioning.
So it wasn't just, completely wiping the slate clean.
Not at first. Not at first.
And then, of course, we have the victory parades in Shanghai and Beijing, these big symbolic events. What was the atmosphere like at those parades?
Well, the Shanghai parade, it was in July 1949, and it was actually raining, but it didn't seem to dampen anyone's spirits.
Mm.
Tanks rolling down Nanking Road, workers marching in organized columns. And the book makes this interesting observation that some of the people who were cheering for the communists had actually been cheering for Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists just a few weeks earlier.
Yeah.
So, it shows you how quickly allegiances could shift.
Yeah, a real sense of, going with the flow, whoever's in power.
Exactly.
And then, of course, the big one, the proclamation of the People's Republic on October 1st, 1949. That must have been a pretty incredible day.
It was. I mean, Mao, he's standing on the rostrum of Tiananmen Gate, wearing a Sun Yat-sen suit, which later became known as the Mao suit. And it's interesting, he's surrounded by some non-communist figures. They're trying to project this image of national unity, and he gives this speech in his Hunanese accent. And the book quotes one of the people who was there, a guy named Li, and he says, "I was so full of joy that my heart nearly burst out of my throat and tears welled up in my eyes. I was so proud of China, so full of hope." So, you can really sense that optimism, that feeling that a new era had begun.
Yeah, a lot of hope and excitement. And then, of course, we have the military rally, the show of force, the tanks, the soldiers.
Exactly. Very carefully crafted image of strength and unity.
So the communists are in control. But then comes the really challenging part. It's not just about winning the war, it's about governing this vast, complex country. And one of the first things they did was to implement this household registration system, the hukou. Can you talk about that and how it shaped life for people?
Yeah, the hukou was it was really fundamental. It was a way for the state to track and control the population. Every household had to register. They had to report any changes, births, deaths, marriages, any movement. And this gave the government an incredible amount of power because it meant they could control the distribution of resources, food rations, housing, jobs. It basically tied people to their place of origin. You couldn't just move around freely anymore.
So it was really about controlling people's movement and their access to basic necessities.
Exactly.
And then alongside that came this system of class labels, the Chengfen. What were those and how did they impact people's lives?
So the Chengfen, they were labels that were assigned to people based on their family background, their occupation before the revolution, their perceived political reliability.
Mm-hmm.
And there were, a lot of different labels like, landlords, rich peasant, middle peasant, poor peasant, worker, capitalist. And they were categorized as good, middle, or bad based on how loyal the communists thought you were.
So it's kind of like creating a new social hierarchy.
Exactly. And these labels, they had a huge impact on people's lives. They affected your access to education, to jobs, to everything. Could you join the Communist Party? Could you join the army? Who could you marry? It was really a way of controlling people's lives.
And then, of course, there's the whole idea of re-education or brainwashing. And this was happening in all sorts of institutions, right? From government offices to schools to factories.
Yeah, it was everywhere. And it was really about reshaping people's thinking, getting them to embrace the communist ideology. So, people were forced to study propaganda materials, to attend political meetings, to write self-criticisms, to confess their past errors. And this was especially intense for people who had any kind of connection to the old regime. If you'd worked for the nationalists, if your family had been wealthy, you were really under pressure to prove your loyalty.
Yeah, to show that you had been reformed.
Exactly.
And the book also talks about some of the social reforms that were implemented during this time. For example, the suppression of prostitution. And it sounds like Shanghai had a bit of a different approach to this than other cities.
Yeah, that's interesting. In a lot of cities, they just banned prostitution outright. It was immediate. It was harsh. But in Shanghai, they took a more gradual approach. They started by imposing stricter regulations on brothels, banning things like gambling and extravagant banquets. And they declared all contracts between prostitutes and brothel owners to be void. And they used these old registration lists to track down and monitor brothels.
So it was more about kind of squeezing them out of business.
Yeah, and putting pressure on them. And some of the brothel keepers, they were publicly executed, as a warning to others. And faced with all this pressure, a lot of brothel owners, they just closed down voluntarily. And the women who worked in the brothels, they were often sent to re-education camps where they were, taught new skills and given political indoctrination. But as the book points out, prostitution didn't disappear entirely. It just went underground.
So it was more about kind of pushing it out of sight, making it less visible.
Exactly.
And then, alongside all these changes in the cities, there was also this massive movement of people from the cities to the countryside. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the communists, they had a real problem with all the refugees, all the disbanded soldiers from both sides, and all the unemployment in the cities. So they started implementing policies to move people back to the countryside. And the countryside, it kind of became this dumping ground for anyone who was seen as, undesirable or unproductive. And a lot of people, They didn't want to leave the cities. That's where they had fled to during the war. That's where they were trying to rebuild their lives. But, many were forced to go, and they were sent to work on land reclamation projects or in these production training camps.
So it was about kind of alleviating pressure in the cities and also, boosting agricultural production.
Exactly. But for a lot of people, it was just another hardship, being forced to leave their homes and start over again in a place they didn't want to be.
And all of this upheaval, it must have had a huge impact on the urban economy. The book mentions, shop closures, rising unemployment.
The economy was in a really bad state. Businesses, they were facing these really high taxes. They were first to buy government bonds. And a lot of them were being managed by party cadres who had no experience in business.
So a lot of mismanagement.
Absolutely. And then, there was the trade embargo from Taiwan and the shift in trade toward the Soviet Union. So it was a really difficult time for businesses. And the book quotes this trader in Shanghai, and he says, shop windows were plastered with signs like, "We reduce prices with pain," and "Shop closing down."
Yeah.
It was a very desperate time.
Yeah, a real sense of things falling apart.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the control of information, the propaganda. The media becomes a tool of the state.
Absolutely. I mean, the media was completely under the control of the party. And the propaganda, it was very direct, very unsubtle. The book describes it as a sledgehammer type approach. And even things like fashion, people were discouraged from wearing jewelry. It was seen as a sign of the old decadent society. So it was really about, controlling every aspect of life, even how people dressed.
So a lot of change happening very quickly. And then, we move into the early 1950s, and this is where things start to get really intense, particularly with the land reform movement. The book describes this as a period of real upheaval and violence in the countryside. Can you talk a bit about what happened during the land reform?
Yeah, the land reform movement, it was really radical. It was aimed at completely changing the structure of rural society. So, the Communist Party, they send these work teams into the villages to mobilize the poor peasants against the landlords and the rich peasants. And they organize these mass denunciation meetings where, people were encouraged to accuse their neighbors to settle old scores.
So it was a very divisive process.
Absolutely. And the land, it was taken away from the landlords and redistributed among the poor peasants. But this redistribution, it was often accompanied by a lot of violence. People were beaten, tortured, even executed.
The book has some really striking stories about these denunciation meetings, and how even seemingly insignificant objects took on a lot of symbolic meaning during this process.
Yeah, they talk about one guy, Liu Yongqing, who received just a single water jar as his share of the redistributed wealth. And another guy, Liu Kexing, he got a horse leg, which was then divided among several families. And even a young party cadre, Zhang Shangling, who was sent to oversee the land reform, she also received a horse leg. And it's like, these things that in normal times would have been seen as worthless, they became these symbols of the revolution, of the overturning of the old order.
Yeah, it's almost like, the spoils of war being divided up. But the violence, it wasn't symbolic, was it? It was very real.
No, it was very real. And it was encouraged by the party. They wanted to break the power of the landlords, and they wanted to instill fear in anyone who might oppose them. And the book gives some pretty horrific examples of the violence, mass killings in Hebei province. Li Jingquan, the party leader in Sichuan, he reportedly ordered the execution of thousands of landlords to speed up the process. And one statistic that really stands out is that by October 1951, an estimated 46,200 people had been killed in just one province as part of the land reform campaign.
So it was a very bloody and brutal period.
It was.
And then right after the land reform comes the suppression of counter-revolutionaries campaign. And this one seems to have been focused more on the cities.
Yeah, this campaign was in the early 1950s, and it was really about targeting anyone who was seen as a threat to the regime. So, former nationalists, members of other political parties, anyone suspected of anti-communist activities. And there were mass arrests, especially in cities like Shanghai. And the book, it talks about this chilling practice of putting red paper seals on the doors of people who had been arrested. It was a way of publicly shaming them and their families.
So it wasn't just about arresting people. It was about kind of terrorizing the whole community.
Exactly.
And then, it's not just the Chinese people who are being targeted during this time. The treatment of foreigners living in China, it also takes a very dark turn.
Yeah, the communists, they viewed foreigners with a lot of suspicion. They saw them as agents of imperialism. And they started implementing policies to force them to leave.
Hmm.
They imposed these really high taxes. They made it almost impossible to sell property. And foreign lawyers, they were especially targeted. The legal system was basically suspended, so foreigners had very little protection. And by the end of 1951, most foreigners had been expelled from China. And the book describes, these once bustling hotels in port cities like Tianjin just standing empty, a sign of how quickly things had changed.
So it's a real shift from, the cosmopolitan China of the past to this very closed, very isolated country.
Exactly. And there was also this really intense propaganda campaign against foreign missionaries. They were accused of all sorts of things, spying, subversion, even abusing children in orphanages. And a lot of these accusations, they were fabricated. They were just made up.
It was really about discrediting them and getting them out of the country. So foreigners are being pushed out, but at the same time, there's this influx of Soviet advisors and technicians, and they're being given a lot of influence in the new China.
Yeah, it's a very stark contrast. The Soviets, they were welcomed with open arms.
Hmm.
And they were given a lot of power, a lot of influence. They were advising the government. They were helping to develop industry. And a whole area of Shanghai, Hangzhou, it was basically taken over to house them. People started calling it the Russian concession.
It's almost like, one colonial power is being replaced by another.
In a way, yes.
And then, of course, we have the Korean War. And China's involvement in the Korean War, it had a huge impact both on the country itself and on its relationship with the United States.
Absolutely. The Korean War, it was incredibly costly for China in terms of human life. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers died in that war. And the conditions they faced were brutal. The book talks about, soldiers freezing to death in the trenches, inadequate supplies. It was horrific. And domestically, the war was used to fuel this really intense anti-American propaganda campaign. Mass rallies, people being forced to donate money. It was this whole atmosphere of hatred and fear.
Yeah, a real sense of being under siege.
Exactly.
And then, amidst all of this, there's also these internal struggles within the Communist Party, purges, power struggles.
Yeah, Mao, he was very aware of the dangers of, complacency, corruption, internal divisions. He often talked about how, revolutions could devour their own children. And he was constantly trying to consolidate his power to eliminate anyone he saw as a threat. And there were these anti-corruption campaigns, but they often targeted lower-level officials. The people at the top, they were usually protected. And one famous case is the execution of Zhang Zishan and Liu Qingshan, these two high-ranking party officials who were accused of corruption. And then there was the 5 Ante campaign, which was aimed at businessmen. They were accused of bribery, tax evasion, all sorts of economic crimes. And a lot of businessmen, they were driven to suicide. They were under so much pressure. And the book describes this really chilling scene where Robert Lowe, he's walking through Shanghai and he sees all these bodies, people who've jumped from buildings. It was a very dark time.
And then, of course, there's the collectivization of agriculture, another really significant change that had a huge impact on lives of millions of people.
Yeah, the collectivization, it started in 1953. And it was basically about taking away farmers' land and forcing them to work on these collective farms. And the government, they imposed this grain monopoly where they set the prices, they set the quotas, and they controlled the distribution of food. And this led to, shortages, famine, a lot of hardship in the countryside.
It's almost like the land reform, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. And, even when there were signs of famine, the government, they often blamed it on natural disasters. They refused to admit that their policies were causing these problems.
So it's a very top-down approach to governing, to economics.
Absolutely.
And the book also gives us some insights into Mao's leadership style during this time. He's often portrayed as this larger-than-life figure, but it sounds like he was also quite unpredictable and difficult to work with.
Yeah, Mao was he was a very complex character. He could be charismatic, he could be inspiring, but he could also be very ruthless and very unpredictable. And the book talks about how his moods would shift suddenly and how even his closest advisors were often afraid of him. And, he often used this very vague language, that he wouldn't be specific about what he wanted. So people were always trying to guess what he was thinking, trying to anticipate his next move. And it created a very tense atmosphere within the party.
Yeah, a real sense of walking on eggshells.
Exactly.
And then as we move into the mid-1950s, there seems to be this this real acceleration in the transition to
Yeah,
socialists.
in 1955, 1956, Mao, he really pushes for this rapid transition, and it leads to, more nationalization of businesses, more hardship, more repression. And the conditions in the prisons and labor camps, they were just horrific. People dying from overwork, from starvation, from disease. And the book describes this punishment where people were kept in these tiny wooden cages. It's unimaginable.
And then there's this system of guanzi, this supervision by the masses. What was that about?
So onesie, it was basically this alternative to prison. Instead of sending people to jail, they would be placed under this constant surveillance by their neighbors, by their coworkers, and they would be forced to do these humiliating tasks, to publicly confess their errors. It was a way of, controlling people without actually imprisoning them.
So it was a very, very public form of punishment.
Absolutely.
And then, there's also these big construction projects, these forced migrations.
Yeah, a lot of people were being moved around, sent to remote areas to work on these massive projects.
Yeah.
And a lot of these projects, they were poorly planned. They were wasteful.
Mm-hmm.
And it led to, housing shortages, disruption, all sorts of problems.
And even for the workers in the big industrial centers, life was pretty grim, wasn't it?
Yeah, the book describes, terrible living conditions in places like Anshan and Nanjing. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, despite the fact that the government was, really promoting industrialization.
So there's a real disconnect between, the rhetoric and the reality.
Absolutely.
And then, all of this leads to growing discontent. And this is where we get to the 100 Flowers campaign. What was the 100 Flowers campaign and why was it so short-lived?
So the 100 Flowers campaign, it was in 1956. And it was basically this brief period where Mao encouraged people to speak their minds, to criticize the party. And it was a very calculated move on his part. He wanted to flush out his opponents to see who was really loyal. And a lot of people, they took him at his word. They started criticizing the party. They started criticizing the Soviet Union. They started talking about, the problems with the system. And it was a very brief period of openness, of intellectual ferment. But then very quickly, Mao turned on those who had criticized him.
And that's the anti-rightist campaign.
Exactly. And the anti-rightist campaign, it was brutal. Anyone who had spoken out during the 100 Flowers campaign, they were targeted. They were labeled as rightists. They were denounced. They were sent to labor camps. People like Chu Anping and Luo Longji, these are prominent intellectuals, and they were just, destroyed.
So it was a real crackdown on dissent.
Absolutely.
So looking back at this period, from 1945 to 1957, it's a time of just immense change for China. The communists come to power, they implement all these radical policies, and it's a very, very tumultuous time.
It is. And, the book, it really highlights the human cost of this revolution, the violence, the repression, the broken promises. And it raises a lot of questions about the nature of revolution, about the challenges of building a new society. Is it possible to achieve these grand utopian visions without resorting to violence and oppression?
Yeah, those are some really big questions. And I think, the book, it doesn't provide any easy answers, but it does force us to confront these really difficult issues.
It does. And one passage that really stood out to me was when the author describes how this climate of fear, it just gradually envelops society, replacing the initial euphoria of the liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a reminder that even when revolutions start with good intentions, they can very easily go astray.
Mm. So a lot to think about, a really fascinating and disturbing period of history.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for sharing your insights with us today, and thank you to all of you listening for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.